Jazzcast Pros.
Hello and welcome back to High Vibe Table Talks. This is your host, Mershawn Hargrave. Today's episode, I am going to give you 6 book recommendations of my top books that I've read over the past year and a half. And previously, when I have given book recommendations, they have been like self-growth, business books, and I have a ton of those recommendations too, but these 6 books are not in that genre. You may be thinking, well, Mershawn, this is a podcast that talks about sales and business. Why are you not recommending those books? I just want to first, for the first portion of this podcast, kind of talk a little bit about my reading journey and explain to you why I'm giving these recommendations and why I think that reading outside of that genre is very important for business people, but just like people in general. And that is something, it's my philosophy, and you may agree or disagree with it, but I'm going to share it here. Welcome to High Vibe Table Talks, the podcast to help you, the cautiously ambitious woman, remove mental barriers and take action now so that you can achieve your high vibe desires. You know, I was a pretty avid reader growing up, and then in college is when I really stopped reading for fun. Pretty much when the last Harry Potter book came out, I'm a big Harry Potter nerd. Once the last book came out, that was really the last book that I read for pleasure for a long time. I stopped reading for fun in college just because you do so much of it for school that I found other ways to kind of find entertainment that weren't books. And it took me a long time to pick that hobby back up. And so when my husband and I started dating, and then when we moved in together, he is a really big reader. And so I was like, okay, maybe this is something I should get back into. And so I started, reading a little bit here and there. And then when I got into sales and business, one of the books I talk a lot about is Fanatical Prospecting. And so I have tons and tons of recommendations about books to read regarding business, sales, mindset around business, things like that. And so if you want more of those recommendations, please let me know and I can compile a list of those as well. One of the limitations I think that business owners run into, and we talk about this a lot during my, co-working calls, we have this very much all or nothing mindset. And it's if I just do more, I'll grow my business faster. And I definitely fell into that as far as not taking time for pleasure. And also I will become more successful if I learn more. And so the only space I gave myself when it came to reading was in self-growth. And so I need to be better. I need to be more. I need to do more. I need to achieve more. I need to learn more so that I can be the best, and then I will be successful. Really switching that mindset to say not only is reading for pleasure okay, reading for pleasure makes me a better business owner. It's just with a lot of things in our lives. Spending time reading makes me a better mother. It makes me a better partner. Exercise makes me a better mother. Meditating makes me a better mother. Coaching my daughter's lacrosse team makes me a better business owner. And there's all of these things that we have to give ourselves the space to do, and our brain the capacity to experience, and that makes us better in all other areas of our life. And so switching that mindset of oh, I should be reading, it was oh, I should be reading more Jen Sincero. If I'm spending time reading, why am I not reading something that's making me better? And 2 things were happening. I was reading a lot less, because if I wasn't in the headspace to be reading a self-growth book, I just wasn't reading at all. And 2, I wasn't allowing my brain to even go to the space of fiction and experience all that you can experience from reading fiction books. I'm a huge mood reader, and so depending on the type of mood that I'm in, will decide what type of book. And so there's sometimes I do need just like a light, fluffy romance, or sometimes I need like a spooky thriller that's, sometimes I need something that's not really well written. It's a page turner. Sometimes I need something that is going to make me think deeply about social, emotional justice issues. And so I'll kind of get into, again, the 6 books that I read over the past year and would recommend to you. And if you are someone who does not read fiction or for pleasure often, this is my urge to you to give it a try and see what is out there, and maybe pick up one of these books and see if it is something that you do enjoy. On top of that, on this podcast, I have talked previously about neuroplasticity and our brain creating new pathways to think about things. And I think reading fiction and reading for fun and reading for pleasure are ways that we allow our brain to rewire and think about things differently. On this podcast, I've also talked about how some of my best ideas have come when I'm out on a walk, or I'm exercising, or I'm driving. And so it's one of those exercises where you're allowing your body and your top of mind brain to focus on something else. And then that gives your subconscious time and bandwidth to work through other things. So I'm not saying that like I come up with my best ideas when I'm reading Harry Potter, but it allows my conscious brain to be a little distracted and just take a little break from all the shit that it is constantly thinking through the rest of the time. So if you feel called to read fiction at all, this is your urge to go to the library. I get most of my books from the library. I do not buy all the books that I read. I have a premium Spotify subscription so that I don't have ads, and I get, I think, 15 hours of audiobooks from that every month. Audible is out there. Libro.fm is a way to buy audiobooks that isn't through Amazon. But I love the library. The Libby app is wonderful. And so that's connected to your library card. So again, you can get digital books or audiobooks on there for free. I have a whole system and a process, and I can share that with you as well, but I won't get into it now because I do want to get into my list of recommendations. But I did really want to say, like, if you're coming on here and are like, ugh, really? Fiction books? This is my urge to you to give it a try and just see if there is a genre that, even if you read, a handful of books every year, I think it is helpful. Okay, let's get into my recommendations and why I recommend them. Do I start with my favorite or do I leave that for last? I'm going to start with my favorite. My favorite book that I have read recently is a book called Babel, or Babel, depending on how you want to pronounce it. And it is by R.F. Kuang. It is dense. It's a fictional book. It has a little bit of like a magic system in there, but that is not like the basis of the book. It is more like just how the world functions, but it is about 4 students who are in college together, and they are kind of learning the history of language and then how they can use it to create different power systems throughout the world. And it is just a beautiful book of found family and the struggles of colonialism and power struggle. And when you see issues that are going on in the world, how do you, like, what choices do you make and how they're different for everybody? And it ripped my heart out in the best way. And it just was in my opinion, a very beautifully written book. Again, it's dense. It's not In the summer, I like to read books that I'm just kind of flying through, and I sit on my back deck and just kind of like read and think and read and listen to music. This was not that type of book. I finished this book, I think like maybe this time last year, and it was very much one where I was like snuggled up on my couch, like very intensely reading. And it just took some time to get through, but the story was so intense and emotional and beautiful and hard and heart-wrenching. It was a wonderful, wonderful book. And, back to why I think you should read fiction. All of the books on this list changed who I am as a person. And that may sound a little odd. I remember when I told my dad, like, about that this book had changed me, and he's not he doesn't read fiction, and he was like, how? And it just makes me think about different viewpoints and how we see other people in this world and the decisions that they make in just such a different way. And I will stop rambling about this book, but I do love, love, love the book Babel by R.F. Kuang. Okay, book number 2 is called Anxious People by Frederick Bachman. This is the 3rd book that I have read by him, and I love his writing so much. I also read A Man Called Uva. A Man Called Uva is how you pronounce it, because I listened to it. They also did a movie, I believe, or a TV show called A Man Called Otto with Tom Hanks. I heard that is really good. The book is wonderful. One of the things I really like about Frederick Bachman's writing, in 2 of the 3 books he did this that I read, and he creates these characters that from the start you dislike them. You're like, ugh, they have all these like quirks and these things that just make them like make you frustrated by them. And by the end of the book, you fall in love with them and just find them so endearing and lovable that it's just a really interesting journey that you go through with these characters. And so Anxious People, I read it at an interesting time as someone who has recently been diagnosed with anxiety and am coming to terms with it. What this book did beautifully was share all the gray that goes on in the world. What the story is about is a bank robber who then tries to rob a bank, runs away, runs into an apartment that is having a showing because it's going to be rented out. And so there's people there for the showing, and he holds them hostage. And so you're like, well, this person tried to rob a bank and now is holding people hostage. Like, of course they're not a good person. And it takes you through the story of like how all these people got to be in that spot at that time. And you're like, oh, things aren't black and white as we would hope them to be. And all these decisions that we make can feel right in the moment or feel like I'm not really sure. And then all of a sudden you're kind of like spiraling and you're like, how did I get here? And so it just was a really great book about like the small decisions that we make in life. And it also does a beautiful job with like found community and how the personality that we put up to the world versus like how we actually feel on the inside. And then when we let people into that side of us and let them see like our vulnerability and who we truly are and the things that make us tick and the things that make us happy and the things that we get anxious about. It just was really, really well done. And I, as again, someone who is coming to terms with my anxiety, a lot of what I am doing is like analyzing the words that I use about myself and the words I use to describe the situation that I'm in and how and the feelings that I'm having. And so this book was just a really interesting journey on all of life decisions that are gray. They're not black and white. So book number 2 is Anxious People. So book number 3, I'm going to give actually 2 books, and it's more depending on like what you're in the mood for, because one was a fiction and one was a memoir, but they're both about the fragility of life and that we don't know what is going to happen. And so that we have to go out and do life anyways. And the impact that we can have on the world around us can be like so meaningful if we just go and take action. The fiction book is The Measure, and it's a really interesting premise because all of a sudden one day, everybody who's 18 and over gets an envelope at their front door, and the envelope has a string in it, and the length of the string tells you how much time you have left on before you die. And so it's very much like, do you open it? If your string is long, what does that mean in the actions that you take? If your string is short, what does that mean? Should people in power only have long strings? Like it's a really, what would you do? How would that impact who you had in your life? Something this kind of reminded me of was when my now husband and I first met. There's a bit of an age gap. He's a bit older than I am. And that was something that I was having a hard time with when we first started dating. And my one friend was like, well, you need to like figure out like if you're okay with it or if you're not, because it's not going to change. And one of the things that I was thinking about is like, he will probably die before I do. So there's going to be a long time where I'm alone. And am I okay with that? That was something that was in my head at the time. You have anxiety? Really? And there was a teacher at the school that I was teaching at the time who had just had her second baby and was having like strange complications post-birth, went to the hospital, found out that she had cancer, and within 3 or 4 months she had passed. And so, I just was kind of like, I could get hit by a car tomorrow. Like, just because that this person is older than me means nothing for our life, but he makes me happy and I really like being with him. And so that is enough at this point. Okay. So The Measure was really interesting, a really interesting premise. And the memoir book is called Between Two Kingdoms. And it is about this woman who gets diagnosed with cancer in her early 20s and what she decides to do with that information and how she kind of processes it, and then how she kind of lives life through her time being sick and post-cancer and how her relationships happen. It was a really like beautiful and really thought-provoking book. Okay, book number 3. And this is actually an author that I'm going to recommend. I read 2 of her books last year, and the way she makes you think about different topics are really interesting. And so the author is Jodi Picoult. I'll put in the show notes the names because Pico is not spelled how you think it was. For a long time, I heard it pronounced Jodi Picoult, and she came on TikTok and was like, it's actually Pico. Anyways, I read Small Great Things by her and Mad Honey. I recommend both of those. She takes very difficult issues and creates beautiful stories around them and makes you think about them very deeply and from lots of different perspectives, and has really hard conversations within the books. And so I highly recommend. Small Great Things is about racism and white fragility and a little bit about like white saviorism and discussions that you have and things that you think of around race and white privilege. And Mad Honey is, I don't want to give too much away on that around like what it's referencing, because I just want you to go out and read it. And it's like a big plot twist that happens in it, and I don't want to give that away. But Mad Honey was a beautiful book. So definitely read something by Jodi Picoult. Book number 5 is a book that I recently finished. It is another chunker. Like, it's a big book. I think it's almost 900 pages. So again, not one that you're like, like loungily reading like at the beach or whatever. It's one where you kind of like hunker down and get really into it, but it is Lonesome Dove. They also made a miniseries TV show that I watched. It is so good. It's another one where the way he develops characters, it's about 2 cowboys who have a ranch in Texas, And they decide to do a cattle drive up to Montana because another cowboy comes back and talks about how beautiful it is and how luscious it is and how they could make a lot of money and have a wonderful life up in Montana. And so they do a cattle drive from Texas to Montana. And if you told me, 8 years ago, Marshawn, you're going to read 900 pages about a cattle drive from Texas to Montana, I would have been like, that's funny. No, I will not. But the character development that goes into this book is just unbelievable. There is one character in the beginning. I actually did a companion read with a friend of mine because she's like, you have to read this. And so we read it together. So I was texting her and I was like, this person is the most annoying, obnoxious character I have ever met. Like, will he ever shut up? And then at the end of the book, I loved him so much. Like, it just was the most unbelievable character arc of going from like, you're so obnoxious to like, you're one of my favorite people ever. It just was really beautiful. And just thinking about like the decisions that our ancestors had to make and like what life was like, and kind of thinking about what middle America looked like, in the 1860s versus what it looks like now. It just was really fascinating to just go back to that sort of time. So it's a big book. The miniseries is amazing. There's a lot of Stephen King books that I have read and then watched the movie and I'm like, ugh, that was terrible. The cast was unbelievable and they kept the essence of the book so well. So if you get here and you're like, I'm not reading any of these books and you haven't watched that series, at least watch the miniseries. It's so good. And the last book I'm going to talk about, it's a thin little, I don't know if it's technically considered a novella, but it's not very long. I think it's under 250 pages-ish. I read it like when we were on a trip last summer. And it is called Even Though I Knew the End. So in this one, it's about like found family. It's this community in Chicago and it's about a brother and sister who are feuding, but then they come back together over issues that are arising in the community. It has beautiful queer characters in it. It's about decision making and like, what would you do for the people that you love? And I just loved it so much. It's one of those books where I don't remember a lot of the specifics of what happened, but I remember how I felt while I was reading it, and it just was so beautiful. And I finished and I was like, I need to tell people about this book. It was so lovely and heartwarming and just made me feel like warm and fuzzy, even through difficult conversations. So those are my 8 book recommendations for fiction books of ones that I have read recently that I think you should pick up, and why I think you should start reading fiction and not just reading business and self-growth books. So thank you so much for listening. Next week's episode, I'm teasing because that's what my podcast producer told me I need to do more of. And we are going to get back to business and we're going to talk about gamifying prospecting. How can you gamify it? Why should you gamify it? It is something that is talked a lot about in the ADHD neurodivergent community around gamifying things that we struggle with and need more dopamine around. And I'm going to talk to you about how to do it with prospecting. So join me next week for that. And until then, remember that big dreams and small steps will transform your life.